The evening air in the outskirts of Bozeman, Montana, carried the dry chill of autumn, the kind that seeped into the skin and made even the streetlights look lonelier. Along the empty stretch of highway, between dusty pickup trucks and aging barns, a flickering neon sign came into view. Redwood Tavern. Inside, pale yellow light washed over dark wooden walls, mingling with a haze of cigarette smoke and the slow, weary hum of an old blues tune from a jukebox long past its prime. It was the kind of bar people didn't come to for fun, but to forget. Laughter mixed with curses, the sharp clink of glasses collided mid-air, and the steady thunk of darts pierced the wooden board at the back. The air was thick with beer, fried meat, and bourbon, a heavy, intoxicating weariness that clung to everything it touched. Here, no one asked where you came from, and no one wanted to talk about tomorrow. Amid the noise, Jamie Collins crept behind the counter. 34 years old, compact frame, brown hair tied low, a calm, deliberate face. The kind of calm that only comes from people who have seen absolute chaos. To the regulars, she was simply the quiet bartender, always smiling, never missing a beat. She arrived early, left late, spoke softly, and never argued. And so her presence had become part of the Redwood Tavern itself, silent, necessary, and easy to overlook. But behind those steady eyes lay a deep, unreachable stillness, the kind that hides a past never spoken of. Years ago, Jamie had worn the uniform of a U.S. Marine, the eagle, globe, and anchor emblem pressed over her heart. She had crossed the harsh deserts of Afghanistan, watched black smoke swallow the sky, and buried brothers she once called family. When she came home, no parades were waiting. Only unpaid bills, a small apartment, and the hollow ache of being forgotten by a world that had moved on without her. Redwood Tavern became her refuge. Here, no one asked who she used to be. No one looked at her with pity. Her work was simple. Pour the beer, wipe the counters, bar hold its breath in just a few minutes. The wooden door of Redwood Tavern burst open with a hiss of wind and the heavy stench of gasoline. Thick boots stomped across the old wooden floor. A group of men in black leather jackets entered, the neon lights flickering across the red tattoos running down their arms, marks that looked more like living scars than ink. On the backs of their jackets, bold white letters read, Rusted Ravens Motorcycle Club. Their corroded iron wings emblem symbolized power in this part of Montana. Leading the group was Troy Bear Henderson, tall, broad, with a thick beard framing a face hardened by arrogance, his eyes a flat, metallic gray. He carried himself like a man who was used to people stepping aside. Every step he took made the air feel heavier. Behind him were his two close friends, Rico and Dean, laughing and shouting crudely, drunk but still wearing the swagger of men who believed the world owed them space. The jukebox kept playing, but somehow the music seemed quieter. A few patrons turned to look, others lowered their heads. No one wanted trouble with the Ravens. They were notorious for being loud, crude, and quick to lose control. The group's laughter echoed when Jamie polished the last glass behind the counter. She didn't look up, only glanced once at the mirror behind the bar. The three men dropped into the center booth directly in front of her and yelled, 3 bourbons, and make it quick, sweetheart. Jamie gave a faint, polite smile, her voice steady and quiet. Yes, sir, 3 bourbons. She poured the drinks, set them down carefully on the table, nodded once and turned away. No extra words. That silence, small and harmless to most, hit directly at Troy's pride. He leaned back, elbows on the table, watching her with a grin that mixed amusement and challenge. "She's a cold one, huh, Bear?" Rico laughed loudly. "Probably thinks she's too good for us," Dean added, leaning forward with a drunken smirk. Troy didn't answer. He just smiled thinly. He lifted his bourbon, swirling it slowly, the light glinting across the long scar on his wrist. Then he stood, the floorboards groaning under his boots, and walked toward the bar. Jamie kept her rhythm, wiping glasses, arranging bottles, refusing to meet. Others stared into their beers. No one wanted to get involved, but every eye was fixed on the bar. Jamie stayed calm. The dim yellow light fell across her face, softening everything except her eyes. Eyes steady, cold, and unshaken. She knew this type. She had seen them before, in places far harsher than this, where testing limits had real consequences. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly. "I have other customers to attend to." One step, 2 steps. Then a rough hand clamped around her wrist, yanking her back. "No one turns their back when I'm talking," Troy growled. The chair scraped sharply against the floor. Someone muttered, "Hey, leave it, Bear." But he ignored them. Jamie's silence once again fueled his anger in the flickering bar light. He gripped tighter, his stare daring her to react. But she didn't pull away. She didn't shout. She simply looked at him. A calm, level gaze so still it made the whole tavern stop breathing. And then, fate arrived. In a sudden, ugly movement, Troy spat a curse and grabbed her by the collar, and with a sharp jerk, the sound of tearing fabric ripped through the air. The entire Redwood tavern froze. A glass fell and shattered on the floor. The music stopped. The laughter died. And in the dim light, what was revealed wasn't weakness, but a symbol. Something powerful, sacred, and untouchable. The sound of tearing fabric sliced through the air like a knife. Everything stopped. The music cut off. The laughter died. Only the soft dripping of spilt beer could be heard, trickling down onto the wooden floor. The bartender stood motionless in the center of Redwood Tavern, her shirt torn, pale skin catching the dim golden light. 1 second. 2. Then a few sharp breaths broke the silence. Someone in the corner let out a shaky, awkward laugh, trying to break the tension. But it failed, because what they saw wasn't shame. It wasn't the image of a woman humiliated. It was a symbol, carved deep and unmistakable. The eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps. The faint light of the tavern fell across the tattoo on her shoulder, making it almost glow. A symbol of honor, of courage, of someone who once swore to defend freedom with her life. For a few breathless seconds, the entire room was frozen in silence. Troy stood still. The crooked grin on his face faded. His eyes narrowed, his hand dropped, his breath caught in his chest. The man who had just tried to assert dominance suddenly realized the full weight of his stupidity. Jamie said nothing. She didn't flinch. She didn't try to cover herself. She simply looked at him, calm, steady, and utterly unafraid. It wasn't the look of someone frightened. It was the look of someone who had stared death in the face and never blinked. An older man sitting in the corner set his beer down, his voice trembling. "Dear God, she's a Marine." The words rippled through the room like wind through dry grass. A few bowed their heads. A few turned away, unable to meet her eyes. Those who had laughed moments ago now wished they could disappear. And Jamie, she stood there, silent amid the thick stillness, like a mirror reflecting every soul in the room. In that moment, every line blurred. Between strength and weakness, between power and dignity, between contempt and respect. She pulled her torn shirt together, buttoned it up and turned away. Each motion slow, deliberate, ceremonial, as if she were burying something. The insult. Troy slowly backed toward his table, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. His two friends hung their heads and left the bar without a word. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt like fear, but respect. J. Butte exhaled softly, her fingers tightening around the bar towel. The light glinted off her brown eyes, deep, steady, and frighteningly calm. No one there knew that this woman had once stood in front of exploding fire and kept walking. No one knew that her silent gaze had once steadied soldiers amid chaos. That night, no one at Redwood Tavern said another word. Every pair of eyes followed her as she worked, as if they were watching something sacred they had never understood before. That night, after the bikers had gone and the noise had faded, Jamie Collins stood alone in the small kitchen behind the tavern. The hum of the glass washer filled the quiet. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke still lingered in the air. She untied her apron, sat on a worn chair, and looked down at the patch of skin where the torn fabric revealed the tattoo beneath, the Marine Corps insignia. Her hand brushed it gently, as if touching an old wound that had never fully healed. It wasn't a tattoo she ever meant to show off. It was a memory, a scar of time, a reminder of heat, smoke, and the burning scent of metal in a faraway land where her youth had been consumed by war. Jamie had grown up in a small Oklahoma town of wind, dry soil, and sun-bleached trailer homes. Her father was a mechanic, and her mother was a waitress at a roadside diner. Life was hard, meager, but what suffocated Jamie most wasn't poverty. It was stagnation. She watched the adults around her repeat the same weary lives year after year. At 18, she wanted one thing: to escape, no matter the cost. When a poster appeared on her high school bulletin board, "The few, the proud, the Marines," she stared at it for a long time. No one believed she would go through with it. Some even laughed. "A girl in the Marines, you won't last a week." But a few months later, she stood on the training grounds of Paris Island, head shaved close, uniform pressed, eyes burning with quiet fire. She hadn't enlisted for glory. She enlisted to find out if she could survive. The following years taught her endurance, the heat, the gunfire, the loss. She served in Afghanistan, where the desert sun could scorch the earth bare and the nights were so dark they could swallow your soul. She once carried a wounded soldier through enemy fire, his blood soaking through her uniform until it felt like her own. That soldier, Corporal Ryan Blake, was her closest friend, and the last face she saw before an explosion buried their entire unit. When she came home, Jamie inked the Eagle Globe and Anchor into her skin, not to show who she was, but to remember who didn't make it back. The world around her fell quiet in the years after the war, but the battle, everything she had buried in that moment, was bare for the world to see. Yet strangely, she felt no shame, no fear, only a clarity she hadn't known in years. She no longer needed to run from who she was. Jamie lifted her head, glancing at the mirror behind the bar. The woman staring back, hair tousled, shirt torn, eyes deep and composed, was no longer the quiet bartender, no longer the survivor, but a fighter, still standing, still alive, in her own way. Out in the main room, a few patrons lingered in silence. One younger man, maybe a reservist, gave her a slight nod, the kind soldiers give each other when words aren't necessary. Jamie returned the gesture with a faint acknowledgement, then bent down to wash another glass. In this world, some battles never make it into history books. There are heroes whose names are never spoken, and sometimes The real battlefield is the one inside your own heart. The air inside Redwood Tavern hung thick, like a heavy curtain that had just fallen over the room. The sound of tearing fabric, the shattering glass, and the sharp breaths were gone. Only silence remained, a silence dense, weighty, almost sacred. Jamie stood there amid the scattered shards of glass and the stunned eyes of the crowd. Her torn shirt revealed the faint outline of the U.S. Marine Corps tattoo beneath, the eagle globe and anchor glowing faintly under the dim yellow light. But she didn't rush to cover it. She didn't lower her head. She didn't speak. Only her eyes, calm, cold, and deep as an old well, stayed fixed on Troy. There was no hatred in them, no accusation, just reflection, a mirror held up before him. And in that mirror, the bully saw his own cowardice. Troy stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly. The arrogance he wore so easily was now nothing but an empty shell. His mouth opened, but no words came. I didn't know, he stammered. No one answered. Jamie slowly bent down, picked up the broken glass, placed it on the tray, then wiped the spilt beer off the counter. Every motion was slow, precise, steady, as if she were simply cleaning up a small mess, not the remains of humiliation. The people around her watched in silence. Shame spread through the room, not just his shame but everyone's, for standing by and doing nothing. A woman in the corner placed a hand over her chest and sighed. An older man, a veteran, gave a slow, solemn nod. They all admitted their guilt in that silence, not with words but lowered eyes. Jamie never looked around. She didn't need to see their remorse. She just kept doing what she always did. Her job. When she finished wiping the counter, she walked over to an overturned chair, lifted it upright, returned to the bar and poured the old veteran a fresh drink. "Thank you, Jamie," the man said quietly, voice low and rough. "Yes, sir," she replied, calm as ever. That was all. No speech, no tears, no anger. But that, just that, was enough to make the entire bar, the people with the quiet light of someone who had walked through darkness and refused to be swallowed by it. From that night on, no one called her Jamie the Waitress. People began to call her something else. Marine Jamie. Not because of the tattoo, not because of her past, but because of how she held her dignity when someone tried to strip it away. A quiet truth settled into everyone's mind that night. Strength isn't the loudest voice in the room. It's the one that stays standing when the room goes silent. And that night, in a small bar in the far reaches of Montana, a woman made the whole world around her bow, not through anger, but through calm. The next morning, the sun over Bozeman rose more slowly than usual. Its light filtered through the fogged windows of Redwood Tavern, glinting off wooden chairs still stained with the dried traces of spilt beer from the night before. No one spoke of what had happened, but everything felt different. Jamie arrived early, as always. She wore a fresh white shirt, walked through the doorway with her steady, quiet stride, and nodded a polite greeting to the bar's owner. No one mentioned the night before. No questions, no whispers, only glances, softer now, more respectful. No one called her Jamie the Waitress anymore. Now they called her Marine Jamie. The story spread fast, beyond the tavern's wooden walls, through the streets and corners of the small Montana town. What began as a rumor became something like a legend. A biker ripped the waitress's shirt at Redwood and almost collapsed when he saw the Marine Corps tattoo. From then on, more people came, not for the beer, but for her, to see her, to thank her, or simply to sit in a place where they knew dignity still lived. One afternoon, a young soldier in uniform walked in as Jamie was wiping down tables. He couldn't have been more than 20, bright eyes, face still soft but already carrying the firmness of duty. He approached the bar and said quietly, "Ma'am, I heard you served in Helmand. I'm being deployed there next month." Jamie looked up, meeting his gaze, eyes that reminded her of her own years ago. She didn't say much. She just smiled faintly, poured him a cup of black coffee and said, "Keep your head up, soldier, and never forget why you signed up." The words were simple, but something in her voice made the young man straighten his back a little more firmly. He saluted her by the book and left the tavern in silence. The other patrons who witnessed it said nothing either, but they felt something warm stir quietly inside. Yet when night came, Jamie still faced her own private battles. She rarely slept. She often sat alone by the window of her small upstairs room above the bar, holding a cup of tea and staring at the empty street below. Sometimes she would hear the roar of a motorcycle, working with a veterans' relief shelter in Helena, helping repair homes for those who had served. Perhaps Jamie's silence had taught him more than any sermon ever could. Slowly, subtle changes spread through the town. The bar added a small sign in one corner, "For those who served." Beneath it hung a few old service pins and a handwritten note. "Respect is not asked for, it is earned." No one said it aloud, but everyone knew why that sign was there. Everyone knew who it was for. As time passed, those who had witnessed that night continued to tell the story to newcomers. But each retelling grew quieter, less dramatic, more reverent, because they came to realize that what stayed with them wasn't the sound of fabric tearing, nor the shock of the crowd, but the image of a woman calmly buttoning her shirt and returning to work, as if her dignity had never been touched. Years later, people still said that on that night, Redwood Tavern fell silent not out of shame, but because everyone in that room understood, for one fleeting moment, that they had witnessed something sacred. Years later, people still told the story of Jamie Collins, the waitress from Redwood Tavern. But over time, it was no longer spoken with curiosity. It was spoken with reverence, soft as breath. Redwood Tavern eventually closed its doors. The old wooden sign was taken down and the bar stools were sold to a smaller tavern nearby. But before leaving, the owner did a straightforward thing. He built a small frame right where the counter once stood and placed inside it a photo. Jamie was standing by the window, sunlight on her shoulder, smiling faintly. Beneath it, written by hand, "Dignity cannot be torn." No one knew where she went after that. Some said she moved to Helena, working in a veterans support program. Others claimed she opened a small cafe in Missoula, its walls lined with portraits of men and women who had served. No names, no ranks. Just ordinary faces with calm, steady eyes. And some believed she simply disappeared, choosing the quiet life she had always wanted. But the echo of that night never left. Each year, on Veterans Day, the people of Bozeman gathered in the town square. Amid the rows of waving flags, they always mentioned the name Marine Jamie. Not through speeches, but through a minute of silence. A minute to remember that courage doesn't only live on the battlefield. It also lives in how we confront injustice in everyday life. At one ceremony, the young soldier from years ago returned, now a sergeant. He spoke to a group of high school students beside him. "She didn't teach me how to fight. She taught me how to stand, even when no one stands with you." The kids listened, their eyes bright. Not because the story was heroic, but because it was true. Because it reminded them that in a noisy world, there are still people who choose silence. Not out of fear, but to protect what's right. And somewhere, perhaps in a quiet little room, Jamie still sat by a window, looking out over an empty street. A cup of tea steamed beside her, the soft afternoon light falling across her face. Those ordinary eyes might live a story powerful enough to change you forever. Some stories we hear only once, but remember for a lifetime, because they remind us that kindness still has a place in this world. If you believe that too, like, share, and subscribe to Deep Life Tales. Every week we bring you real journeys, stories of people rediscovering dignity, compassion, and their quiet strength. Deep Life Tales, where the smallest stories awaken the greatness inside us all.